Was that me? Yeah, that was me. Okay, that's better. Thanks. Can everybody hear me? All right. Now I know that, well, let's go ahead and get started. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So we're going to be talking about the Q source tonight, and it is important because it tells us a lot about what the gospel writers, particularly Luke and Matthew, had in front of them when they were writing their gospels. If you remember, and I'm just as a sort of a reminder, the resurrection would have been around 33 AD, we think, maybe 35 AD. It doesn't really matter in one sense. It's a year or two difference. But it was around 33 AD. Mark was written 37 years later, in 70 AD, they think, around 70 AD. And then Matthew and Luke were both written sometime around 75 AD, they think, a few years later. And then, of course, John is the outlier that we're not talking about. John is not synoptic. We don't read John with, I'll just put him off like this. We don't read John with the other Gospels. The Gospel of John we're going to talk about next year at this time. And as I said before, I've never taught the Synoptic Gospels, but I have taught the Gospel of John. I've taken a course in it, and I think I've taught it at least once, maybe twice. And it's very good. It's very different, though. One way that I think you can look at it is that Mark, which is the earliest gospel, focuses on the humanity more of Christ, and he's the secret, the Markian secret of who Jesus is. Whereas John is just the opposite. He focuses on the divinity of Christ. But let's start with Luke. And this is from chapter 1, verse 1 in the prologue. Since many have undertaken to compile, this is chapter 1, verse 1. Since many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word have handed them down to us, I too have decided, after investigating everything accurately anew, to write it down in an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may realize the certainty of the teachings you have received. So it's pretty clear that Luke is indicating when he wrote this that he did a careful study and research on writing this. And in particular, he talked to eyewitnesses. Now, Luke was not an eyewitness. He's saying that as much in there. In the footnote, here's what it says, which I think is also very good. The Gospel, according to Luke, is the only one of the Synoptic Gospels to begin with a literary prologue. Making use of a formal literary construction and vocabulary, the author writes a prologue in imitation of the Hellenistic Greek writers, and in so doing relates his story about Jesus to contemporaneous Greek and Roman literature. Luke is not only interested in the words and deeds of Jesus, but the larger context of the birth, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus as the fulfillment of the promises of God in the Old Testament. As a second or third generation Christian, notice that, second or third generation, he's not a first, his debt to earlier eyewitnesses and ministers of the Word, but claims that his contribution to this developing tradition is a complete and accurate account told in an orderly manner and intended to provide Theophilus, who literally means friend of God, so that Theophilus may not be a real person. What they're saying is he's a play on words there. And other readers with certainty about earlier teachings that they have received. And so the question then becomes, what are the sources? What did Luke have before him? What did Matthew have before him when they were writing? We talked at first about what is a gospel, right? That was the first session. And then the second session was how did they go about doing it? This session we're going to talk about what did they have in front of them. And then next week we'll start with the Gospel of Mark, and we'll spend 2 weeks on Mark, 2 weeks on Matthew, 2 weeks on Luke, and then a wrap up, okay? So, first and foremost, oral storytelling. That is the eyewitnesses' accounts that he had, that he mentions. He probably spoke to people who, in fact, were there with Jesus and saw him speak and saw him, saw the whole passion, you know, different witnesses looking at different aspects of the passion. And then ultimately his resurrection. He spoke undoubtedly to people who saw Jesus after he not ascended, but after he was resurrected. As I recall, in one of the Gospels, it says there were 500 of his followers. So 500 followers is a lot of people that would have seen him. It wasn't just the 12 apostles, or 11, I should say. You don't count Judas. Judas was already dead. But you have eyewitness accounts, and then you probably had second-hand accounts. Now, that's oral, right? So that's the first thing, is he's sitting down and interviewing people about Jesus. And he's asking them, he says in here, about, it's in the footnote, I take that back, it's in the footnote, but he's asking them about his life, meaning where was he born, who was he, his ministry, which would be what did he teach, and his miracles, and how do the two interrelate, and what did people think of who he was at the time? Did they understand him to be the Messiah, or was he just another prophet? And then ultimately his passion, his arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, and then his resurrection and his ascension, and that's what we're looking at. So, written sources. The first written source that we know they relied on is this book, the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament, for lack of a better word. Why do we know that? Because virtually every passage that is quoted, every Old Testament passage that's quoted both in the Gospels and in the New Testament in general, they rely on the language taken from the Septuagint. So they had to have had it in front of them. So that's the first book. Now, what about the Gospel of Peter? We talked about the Gospel of Peter last week. Did they have the Gospel of Peter in front of them about this sort of bizarre resurrection scene with Jesus being his head going all the way to the clouds? No, because it was written about 175 to 190 AD. So the Gospel of Peter is going to be over here. (175 to 190 AD). So it's out. It could not have been relied upon then because it wasn't written until after they all had died, actually. Okay? In addition, it contains a lot of heresy, as you remember me talking about. So the next gospel is the gospel of, let me back up. Before I get to the Gospel of Thomas, the question arises, when were the letters of Paul written? They were written probably between 50 and 65 AD. Letters of Paul. So, did they have the letters of Paul in front of them? They could have. Timing was right. Here's what we know. The letters of Paul are not quoted or explicitly referenced in the Synoptic Gospels. The Gospels, as we said, were written somewhere between 70 and 75 AD, somewhere in there. It could be later, 80 AD. The Gospels were written earlier, but there's nothing in them. There's nothing in the Gospels that quote from the letters of Paul. Now, it does have shared theological themes. For example, Paul on the justification by faith says in Romans 1:17, the righteous shall live by faith. And then Jesus in Luke 18:9 through 14, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, emphasizes justification by God's mercy rather than works. So that's a theme that is in both. Okay, so in other words, they're in the same ballpark, right? They're thinking the same way, but they're not relying on them. In addition, the love is God's greatest commandment. Again, Paul says, love is the fulfillment of the law, which is in Romans 13:10, and Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself in Mark 12:31. So what we can say is that there was probably a Pauline influence in the Synoptic Gospels, but they didn't have them in front of them. That's my point, okay? We're trying to see, you think about Luke or Matthew sitting down, after I'll get to that in a second. Well, I want to jump to the Gospel of St. Thomas. So the question is the Gospel of St. Thomas relied upon by Luke and Matthew? And here's the thing, the dating of St. Thomas, that writing, and it's just a collection of writings, we're not talking about whether it should be or should not be considered a gospel. We're more talking about, did they rely on it? Because the Gospel of Thomas, and that was the handout. Do they have the handout? Right? Okay. The Gospel of Thomas, the handouts you got in front of you, it's a collection of sayings. It's not, there's no narrative in the Gospel of Thomas, and there's no mention whatsoever of the Passion. There's no direct reference to the Passion. So it can't be a gospel because of that. You see what I'm saying? Because the gospel is what? Goes back to, what does gospel mean? Gospel means what? The good news, right? And the good news is what? Somebody tell me, what is the good news? The Savior has been born to save the world, and this is the way that He's going to do it, and this is the way that He did it. And so the Gospel of Thomas doesn't do that. It's just a collection of sayings, and it's nice, and I mean, you can look through those and see. Let's see, I wanted to read, let's see. Then there's the question of, did they rely on it? That's the second question. There's an early date hypothesis that says it was written somewhere between 50 and 100 AD, which would put it such that it could have been relied upon by Luke and Matthew. And what they find is that some scholars argue that St. Thomas was written in the mid to late first century, possibly contemporaneous with or shortly before or after the canonical Gospels. This argument is based on the simplicity of the saying and its lack of a narrative. On the other hand, other scholars date it to the mid-2nd century, pointing to it parallels of Gnostic thought. You remember that Gnosticism? Well, it's got Gnostic thought in it, which makes it probably more likely that it dates later than early. But they don't know. It's not as clear as their dating of St. Peter. So you've got St. Thomas, Gospel of, we'll put Peter and then Thomas. Thomas, the dating is questionable. But neither one of them are Gospels, and we can clearly say Peter was not relied upon. There are some similarities between Matthew and Luke and Thomas, but there's also, those similarities are also with what we will call the Q source. So now we come to, what we got is Oral statements. They relied on oral statements. They had the Septuagint in front of them. They had the Gospel of Mark in front of them, we know. And then they had, we think, another document called the Q source. And so what are we talking about? Well, if you have Matthew, if there's a passage that's in Mark that is in Matthew and Luke, then it's a three-source passage. That's what they're talking about. If it's a passage in Mark that is only in Matthew, then it's a two-source passage, you see. And then if it's a passage in Mark that's only in Luke also, then it again is a two-source passage. Or two-source passage, that's right. The last one then is if it's in Matthew and Luke, since they were both probably written around the same time, they must have been relying on something else, and that something else is what they call the Q source, which is, Q stands for quell, Q-U-E-L-L, which means source. So it just gives us a better understanding of what they're relying on when they're writing what they're writing, okay? So, she has a clear explanation of the significance of Q and the synoptics, and I want to read that passage. It's on page 58. It starts down near the bottom. It says, Q also includes some narrative elements such as familiar threefold temptation of Jesus, quite unlike Mark's brief notice about the testing of Jesus. However, when one reaches the synoptic accounts of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection, one no longer finds examples of this double tradition. Matthew and Luke either parallel Mark or incorporate special traditions of their own. Therefore, here's the important part, most scholars agree that Q was primarily a collection of sayings and episodes, but not a precursor to the gospel as a life of Jesus. Nor does that collection fit the concern with the death and resurrection of Jesus as a key to salvation, an emphasis reflected in bits of early tradition cited by Paul. You see that whole thing about, what they're saying is that the passages that are in Matthew and Luke that are the same, that are from this, what they think is the Q source, those passages don't have anything to do with, number one, the Passion and the whole Passion story. And the Passion story, you really think about it. We talk about Jesus' ministry, and we spend from week 1 of Ordinary Time to week 34 of Ordinary Time, and we split it with, when we get to, we'll come up on Lent here. We'll probably be 8 weeks in, 9 weeks maybe, and we have Lent and Easter, but then we jump back into Ordinary Time, and for all these weeks that we talk about, which is what most of these Gospels talk about, is Jesus' ministry, his birth and death, his birth, and there's two explanations or two stories of his birth, but then it's about when he was baptized, after he's baptized, then his ministry. And there's two parts to that, and one is what I call the teaching, and then it's coupled with the miracles. And that goes for that's a 3-year period almost, and that's what most of the Gospels are. But the most important part of the Gospels are what? The Passion Week. Because in the absence of the Passion, Jesus is just another prophet. Okay? And so with the Passion, it is that Jesus, that this whole mission that he is on is one where he is going to redeem the world by his death and resurrection. Okay? And that everything focuses and flows to that. Paul spends more time, I think, on talking about that week, not what happened, but the significance of the Passion, as opposed to necessarily all of the sayings of Jesus. As you probably saw somewhere in there, I know she talks about the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is not, Jesus didn't come up with the Golden Rule. I mean, that was already in writing in various forms. I think from other religions at the time, and in particular, I think you could probably find it. I'm trying to remember where. I'd have to look, but he didn't come up with the golden rule, okay? So, I'm just looking back over this to make sure this is not Mark's. No, that's it. So, now that we've established Q and we've established that we talked about the word synoptic, remember? Synoptic is reading it or looking at it together. And so what we want to do is take an example of reading it together. And what I'm going to do is to read from, this is the calming of the sea. And if you've got a Bible, it's Mark 4, 35 through 41. And it's interesting, there's this difference, particularly between Mark and Matthew, that you really don't catch unless you look at it closely, okay? So Mark chapter 4, 35 through 41. On that day, as evening drew on, he said to them, "Let us cross to the other side." Leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat just as he was, and other boats were with them. A violent squall came up, and waves were breaking over the boat so that it was already filling up. Jesus was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. They woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Be quiet, be still." The wind ceased and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, "Why are you terrified? Do you not yet have faith?" They were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this whom even the wind and sea obey?" And here's what she says about that. This is on 64. I have all these little stickies. I think I'll have stickies in my coffin, to remind me to do things. You have them everywhere. Okay. This is on page 61. All three versions of that story conclude with the disciples being astounded by Jesus' ability to command the wind and the sea. But Mark's way of telling the story introduces a jarring note. After calming the story, Jesus rebukes the disciples. Have you no faith? Mark's disciples have questioned Jesus' concern for them as well. "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And she goes on to say, a stage director or an oral storyteller might well have this exchange performed as a harsh clash between Jesus and his disciples. And Mark does not, the disciples are kind of like they're kind of bumbling is the word I use. They're kind of clueless. A lot of the time, they don't know what's going on, and he just kind of looks at them like, "Don't you get it?" And then it goes on to say, "Now look at the way in which the other evangelists have scripted the same exchange." Jesus still comments on the faith of his disciples. That faith remains uncertain. Matthew's Jesus highlights their fear as evidence of weak faith. And he says, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" Luke's suggestion in that terror of the moment the disciples forgot the faith that they had in Jesus. Where is your faith? Notice another shift that Matthew makes in telling the story. And this is key, he has Jesus speak to the disciples about faith before performing the miracle, not after, as in Mark and Luke. The miracle serves as a demonstration, that is, to bolster the faith of the disciples. Get it? That's that's just a little difference. But one way, if you look at it in the way of Matthew, is that he's going to show them that they should have faith in him. and he asks them about the faith before he shows them. Whereas the others, he does it, and then then he says, "Don't you have any faith?" Notice another difference in Matthew and Luke that ameliorates the harshness of the exchange between the disciples and Jesus. The disciples no longer question Jesus' concern for them. They cry out to him for assistance to rescue them. Luke also shifts the narrative order so that Jesus is said to fall asleep before the gale sweeps down the Sea of Galilee. Of course, Mark may have understood the story that way if one had asked him to narrate the events in a strictly chronological order. Beginning a story and then sliding into a crucial detail just before it becomes necessary to the action is frequent enough in storytelling. You get it? That Mark wants to tell it like an action movie almost, right? And so it goes on to say, in the film, the frame shift from the disciples struggling at the oars to Jesus sleeping in the stern. That's the shift. So the variants in Matthew and Luke are like the changes in script or blocking the director makes. The basic story remains the same, but the audience gains a different feeling for what was going on between the characters. This is that image of the haystacks. And Jeff Atwater, his wife Vivian, was watching online the first night when I was talking about the different haystacks, the different aspects of Jesus, looking at them in this Monet painting, in the haystacks paintings, which are located at the Chicago Art Institute. Well, I didn't realize this, but Vivian is a retired art historian, and she just loved the fact that I gave that little example, because she went on to say, and Jeff told me, do you know how he painted those? What he did was he had 4 easels set up, what they call plein air, out in the, and so like the first painting was in the early morning, the next one was at midday, so the light was different, and that's what he was trying to do, is to show the difference. And that's what I think we see in the synoptics, is we're seeing the same Jesus, but from different angles, okay? And you say to yourself, well, what about Luke? Luke wasn't there. Well, Luke wasn't there, but he talked to a lot of people. So you're still getting a different angle from that of, and Mark was not, we don't know if Mark was there or not. I still am not clear on that one. But clearly Matthew was there, okay? Matthew was an eyewitness. So, now I already mentioned that the one source that I looked at is the Gospel of Thomas possibly a Q source? And I just do want to read from, this is on page 68, 69, and she pretty much says the answer is no. But it talks about how the Gospel of Thomas how it came about. I say came about, how it was discovered. This is on page 68 in the middle of the page. Until the mid-20th century, the existence of a collection of sayings which lacked the biographical framework of Jesus' life remained a guess based on source criticism. Neither Matthew nor Luke could be shown to have taken the common sayings material from the other. Slender additional evidence that sayings of Jesus circulated among the Christians could be found in Paul's occasional references to sayings of the Lord. However, no such sayings had survived the earliest manuscripts. Then, when a collection of codices containing over 50 works that had been translated from Greek into Coptic, and Coptic is Egyptian, was discovered in 1945, the situation changed. One of the works discovered was a collection of sayings of Jesus. It opened with, "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymos, Judas Thomas, wrote down." The title given this collection in the Codex is, in a Codex, we know what a Codex is. It's not the scrolls, it's written books. The Gospel according to Thomas. Once the Coptic had been discovered, scholars recognized that some Greek fragments containing sayings of Jesus belonged to the Gospel of Thomas. The Coptic codices were copied in the middle of the 4th century. That would be around the year 350. That would be after the Roman Empire had turned Christian, okay? But the Greek fragments have been dated to the late 2nd or early 3rd century. So we know at least one of the collections of Jesus' saying remained in circulation for several centuries. While the Gospel of Thomas confirmed the existence of these sayings, it did not provide scholars with a 2nd or 3rd century edition of Q. There's no connection between the order of the sayings in Thomas and Q. So Thomas is not Q. And to go on to say, let's see, what does she say? So if we can't reconstruct, I have written down here, we can't reconstruct Q exactly, what is the point of the Q source? And that's where she says on 82. Here's what she says at the bottom of 82 about trying to reconstruct the Q source. She spends a lot of time on it, and basically I think she says you can't do it. And here's what she says. For the use of Q in a minimalist sense as a hypothetical source to explain how Matthew and Luke composed their Gospels, its exact parameters can be left indefinite. Sayings collections are so easily changed that multiple copies of collections are more likely to differ in content or order than to be identical. The overlap of written and oral traditions during the 1st and 2nd centuries make the mix of semantic overlap and variations that one observes in Q and Thomas inevitable. So she's saying that, what they know is in Q, what they think is in this Q is also, some of it's also in Thomas. And so, but that's just, that doesn't mean that Thomas is Q, okay? And, one of the things I think that helps us to understand Luke and Matthew in particular is how they were written. How many of you have seen, I think it's in season 3 of The Chosen. How many of you have seen season 3? A few of you. Okay. In season 3 of The Chosen, in The Chosen, how many of you know what I'm talking about when I say The Chosen? You know what that is? Does anybody not know what I'm talking about? Okay. All right. So, in season 3 of The Chosen, there are some scenes where, first off, Matthew is portrayed, and this is a backstory, this is fiction, this is not anywhere in Scripture, but Matthew is portrayed as being autistic. Is that the right word? With the people that have seen it, he's a little different. He's autistic, but he's very precise. And so what they do is they have him running around taking notes all the time. And with the idea that he's taking these notes as these events are happening, and therefore he's got a record of everything. That is just pure speculation as to how he went about writing it. Now, to me, since we know that Matthew has Mark in it, there's language from Mark in Matthew, and there's language from Luke in Matthew. I think, and there's also quotations from the Septuagint in Matthew. I think Matthew was sitting down sometime after the destruction of Jerusalem, somewhere in Judea, not in Jerusalem probably, I don't think. You got to remember when the Zealots tried to overthrow Jerusalem and killed all the garrison in Jerusalem, the Roman garrison. I mean, the emperor was mad and sent 2 crack legions down there, and they just That's why the temple was completely destroyed, and what's left is the Western Wall, which is what they pray at now. Okay, so I'm thinking that Matthew was somewhere in Judea, and he had a copy of this, and he had a copy of Mark, and he had a copy of something else in front of him when he was writing this. And they were all a pile of scrolls, probably, because that was still not, what did we say last time? The Christian writings in the 2nd century were predominantly scroll and very few codices, but then by the 4th century it flipped. Well, he was pre-2nd century. He's like in the 1st century writing this, okay? Is any of this helping? To me, it's fascinating because you're talking about putting together, we know, this is very important. We know he had this before him. Where else could he get it? But and it was not in a written form. It probably wasn't in a codice. He was probably looking at scrolls, the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. And we know he had Mark in front of him. And he had some other things in front of him, okay? So then we talk about I've already talked about this, why Q can't be a gospel. Although it was theoretically written before Matthew and Luke, and I put a question mark, we don't know when, but there is no narrative, and it fails to mention the death and resurrection. So the narrative, the reason they know that is the passages that are common to Matthew and Luke, but not to Mark, which are the Q source, don't contain anything about. It's mostly the sayings, although there are some events. So the next question I've got down is, what do the sayings materials from the Q source tell us? And on page 98 and 99, she tells us. She says, the wisdom sayings make a general this is the sayings material at the bottom. Scholars distinguish an early layer of the sayings collection from collection Q from later one often appeal to the difference between wisdom and apocalyptic. Wisdom sayings make a general statement or observation about how human beings act, or they incorporate maxims about how one should act to be happy or successful. Apocalyptic sayings carry the tone of warning and appeal to repent before the judgment, or statements about the fate of persons or groups. This approach to Q treats the wisdom material as earlier and more characteristic of Jesus. The strong apocalyptic tone that runs through the final collection reflects the shift in understanding during the decade or so after his death, when they thought he was going to reappear. So what is she saying? She's saying some of the sayings that are in Q are older sayings, we're pretty sure, because they're talking about wisdom. And don't you know, what does Matthew, Mark, and Luke, a lot of what Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about are the wisdom sayings of Jesus. And so that's where, what I'm saying is, some of these wisdom sayings that are common to these two came from here. Whereas some of the other wisdom sayings came from Mark, and then Matthew has his own wisdom saying, and Luke has their own wisdom saying. Each of them have I didn't even mention this. This is one source, just Mark, where it's nothing in common with the others, okay? So it's complicated, isn't it? You can see why they wanted to meld it all together into a single gospel, which they call which they did actually. It was called the Diatessaron. Remember? Did I talk about the Diatessaron? Yes, no? Okay. The Diatessaron is this attempt in the 2nd century to put them all together. And they actually used it in the Syrian Christians, I believe, for a period of time, and then they dropped it. Because they were using the Gospels, but they were trying to, make it all fit. And I think, if you think about a person, if you try and do that's really missing the point. It's like none of us look exactly the same to different. Each person in here was going to, if you were asked to give a description of me and what I'm doing right here, it's all going to be a little bit different, right? Same thing. Except Jesus, who is fully human and fully divine, is much more complicated than we can imagine. Okay. What time is it? Oh, good. Okay. There's two important facets of the Q saying, which are on page 100, which I thought were worth noting. That first, they take on a meaning from the specific context in which they are used, and second, they appeal to a universal experience, not to revelation or to authority of a particular sage. What makes Jesus' use of wisdom tradition special must be the context in which he invokes particular maxims, or in the case of non-retaliation and love of enemies, the larger discourse about the moral obligations that he framed with the traditional maxim. So he's putting his own spin on exactly some of these traditions and sayings, you see what I'm saying, within the context of the world at the time. But I go back to remember, the wisdom literature contained in the in these synoptic gospels is not near as important as the passion. Because without the passion, he's just another prophet. Okay? So now we jump to the parables. And as she says, I think at some point, 1/3 of the teachings of Jesus in the synoptics is in the form of parables, similitudes, or comparisons. So Jesus taught by using parables on purpose. And there's this whole thing about him teaching parables and what? He teaches it to the masses and then, particularly in Mark, I think, then the apostles go, once he walks off the stage, so to speak, the apostles go, what exactly did you mean? And then he tells them, he says, but I'm going to tell you guys, but I'm not going to tell the masses, because he's going to make them think about it. I think that's, to me, that's what the parables are about, is making people think. So the purpose of the parables, she says, there's threefold. They could be one of any three of these. One is that it contains a hidden truth. 2, it is a puzzle to be cracked. Or 3, it is clarifying an obvious truth by comparison or analogy. And so now on page 105, she says, English speakers will be familiar with phrases such as lost sheep, right? Parable of the lost sheep. Good Samaritan, everybody knows that one. Prodigal son, even if they've never heard of the parables to which those phrases refer. The Greek word parabole can refer to a wide range of illustrative forms, from single sayings such as a proverb or a maxim, to simple comparisons to extended stories illustrating larger concepts. As a translation of Hebrew, mashal, parable, can refer to riddles as well. This semantic range creates an awkward juxtaposition between treating Jesus' parables as hidden truth, a puzzle to be cracked, and considering parables as obvious truths, a way of clarifying meaning by comparison or analogy, which I just mentioned. So there's, and then what she does, which I love, the first chart, I will be honest with you, that first chart that she had that goes on for page and page, this is on starts on page 73 and goes for like 6 or 7 pages. I don't know. I don't know what that is. But I do know the chart on page 107. This gives you an idea of let's look. She calls it parables in the triple tradition. These are parables of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So for example, the sower's seed or the mustard seed. Everybody knows the parable of the mustard seed, right? Well, those are all in all 3 of the synoptic gospels, and the mustard seed is also in the Gospel of Thomas in a much more in a simpler form. Then you have the parables that are in Q, meaning that they're not in Mark, but they're in Matthew and Luke, and they think that therefore there's that third source out there. And there's a whole bunch of them. Do you notice? I noticed this, and I'm just asking what you think. What do you notice about the parables in the triple tradition versus the parables in Q, for example? You notice any difference in what the parables are about? Awkward pause. All right. Look at sower's seed, interpretation of sower's seed, mustard seed, and wicked tenants. What do they all have in common? Agriculture. Who said agriculture? You get a gold star. I think that those were simple. Agriculture is a simple thing that the people could relate to. When you get to the parables of Q, you got lost sheep. Okay, that's a shepherd. Wise and foolish builders. That's building things. Slaves, children playing, good gifts, great. So it's much more complex. Okay. So the reason being that I think that in order to be in the triple tradition, if you look at parables in Mark and one other source, you do have slaves waiting on the master, but the other one is seed growing secretly. So Mark is in certain ways simpler, if you see what I'm saying, the parables. But that is what you're looking at, and then you have parables of Luke, special material. Look at what Luke does on the next page. The Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the rich man and Lazarus. These are all only in Luke. And I think that Luke, he probably had a lot of people that he talked to, and they would mention these stories, right? When I give a homily, people will come up to me and say, oh, that was a wonderful homily, blah, 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 blah. And one of the priests once said, when they say that, it's like they're petting the puppy. I feel so good, But when you ask them, and a couple of times I'll say, what was it about it? They go to the stories. I can tell you a homily that I gave 8 years ago, and if there's a story in there that really struck that person and connected with them, they can tell me back that story. They can tell me the story back. So it's the stories that people remember. They don't remember all the dry stuff, right? And so that's what the parables are, and that's why he taught in parables. So that's why I think, for example, you've got these rich stories here in Luke that are nowhere else. I mean, think of if Luke had not been written, we would not have the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan and the rich man and Lazarus and the Pharisee and the tax collector. Good gosh. Those are wonderful, wonderful stories to think about. Okay? Now, I talked about the chart. Next is the miracle stories. Yeah. Okay. She talks next about the miracle stories on page 114 and 115. And my blood pressure kind of went up when she started talking about them. She says at the bottom of 114, the most striking narratives about Jesus during his ministry involve miracles. Sayings collections like Q are almost untouched by a large number of miracle stories that circulated concerning Jesus. Again, miracle stories. They're stories. That's why the parables are not miracle stories necessarily, like the parable of the prodigal son or the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's just a story, but it has a moral to it. It has a point that he's making. She goes on to say, many modern readers find the miracle stories, quote, somewhat embarrassing. They prefer to supply naturalistic or sociological explanations for as many of them as possible. Is it easy to find psychological explanations for most of the exorcism cases, or perhaps even for the cases of paralysis? The dead might merely be comatose, eye disease and blindness due to irritation of the sun, and the like are not overly problematic. The sticking point involves natural miracles. Food multiplication has been given a sociological explanation that people who have been hoarding became willing to share. I've heard that one before. But then she goes on to say, the miracle stories were problematic in Jesus' time for a different reason. Since people had no other explanation for most of the natural and human disasters that would happen than the gods behind it, they would have not been offended by the idea of miracles. It goes on at the bottom of the page, control over the power of nature was not even limited to gods or human beings thought to be close to gods. Magicians also claimed the ability to manipulate natural forces, to cause disease or to ward off the evil caused by others. Jesus' opponents accuse him of acting as an agent for Beelzebub, and that is of practicing magic. So my response to all that is the resurrection. The resurrection happened because everything is written in light of the resurrection. Now, did all of these miracles happen? I can't tell you that all of them happened, but I do, in my heart of hearts, believe that especially when it comes to the healing miracles, that he did heal people that would otherwise not be able. He did it beyond what were natural means at the time, any doctor or whatever. And then again, the nature miracles, such as the calming of the storm, those sorts of things. I truly believe that, because otherwise, if you do away with the miracle stories, then why not do away with the resurrection? You see what I'm saying? It's the greatest miracle, right? That's why we're all here, right? And so she's mainly bringing up these points of this is what scholars think. Okay, that's what they think. But science is not the be-all, end-all. When I was in college, I took a lot of philosophy courses, and I took a course on the philosophy of science. And science is a human invention. And since as humans, we're finite creatures, science itself is limited. And I don't know that science itself, can prove or disprove all of these things because they happened 2,000 years ago. Okay? That's just my view, for what it's worth. And I think, the last narrative, the Passion narrative, 119. This is not the paragraph about Socrates. But what she basically says is the death of Socrates in 399 BC and the crucifixion of Jesus are the two best known ancient stories of the trial and execution of innocent man. And Socrates could have gotten out of being executed, but he stuck by his guns. And as a result, they told him that he had to drink, what's the poison? Hemlock, thank you. I was going to say hyssop, and I knew it wasn't hyssop. Drink hemlock. And as a result, he died. Goes on to say, Matthew's Passion narrative adds a few incidents or details to the story as told by Mark. Luke's account diverges further from Mark than does Matthew's. John's Gospel goes its own way, both in chronology of the Passion and in its portrayal of Jesus' trial and death. For example, the Synoptic Gospels have Jesus remaining silent before Pilate. John's Gospel has a more dramatic ceremony. Pilate shuttles back and forth between his exchanges with Jesus inside and with the Jewish accusers outside. The Synoptics report that Simon of Cyrene was conscripted to carry Jesus' cross to the place of the execution. John's Gospel insisted that Jesus carried it himself. Of course, this all goes to John's view of Jesus as being divine. And did you know, of course, John's Gospel doesn't have the Last Supper in it, but he gives us a different view. He does the feet washing, but he gives us a different view of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane when he's arrested. When Jesus is arrested by the authorities in the Synoptics, Jesus is pretty. By that time, he's not. What's the word I want to use? He's not even hardly. I don't even think he says anything. They just sort of. Oh, he does say when whoever it is that chopped off the ear of whoever it was. That's a good example. I mean, one gospel says it was so-and-so and so-and-so, and another one it didn't say who it was. Well, that's a good example of that probably actually happened because it's such an odd event that, it probably did happen. But John's gospel, if you read it carefully, and we'll get to this in John, but I just sort of show the complete difference. When Jesus is approached by the authorities, they ask him something about, let me see if I can find it real quick. I'd rather read it than... Here it is. Jesus, knowing everything that was going on to happen to him, went out and said to them, "Whom are you looking for?" They answered him, "Jesus the Nazarene." This is chapter 18, I'm down at verse 5. He said to them, and in capital letters, "I am." Judas, his betrayer, was also with him. When he said to them, "I am," get this now, they turned away and fell to the ground. Why would they fall to the ground? Because I am is the great I am who am, which is Yahweh, which means he was saying, I am God. And they just, because of the power of the divinity of Jesus, they just collapsed right in front of him. Of Of course, they get back up and they arrest him and take him away. But that is in John, which is one of the little differences of how you look at who Jesus is, okay? The mystery of him being fully human and fully divine, it's especially during the Passion is anyway. I won't go any farther. It's 7:25, 55 minutes. We got 5 minutes for questions if anybody has questions. I'm sort of at a stopping point. Was this of any help at all? Sort of, kind of, maybe. I hope so. The thing that I'm really passionate about is what were these particular two people, and him to a lesser extent, because what was he looking at? Well, he couldn't be looking at Matthew and Luke, so he's probably looking at the Septuagint, because there's quotes from there, and Mark also from the Septuagint, from the Greek Old Testament. He was probably going on oral testimony. What else? We don't know of any writings that he was relying on. Maybe he was. But when you write something, have you ever tried to sit down and write like something that happened 30 or 40 years ago? And you're sort of remembering, and I was going to tell a story. It's going to be in the bulletin reflection. I was going to tell a story about the girls when we first adopted them, and I had the story written out, and I gave it to Janet to read, and she looked at it and she goes, "Well, you got it wrong." I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "It wasn't Becky, it was Khaki." I said, "Oh, see." And that was only like 15, 20, it was 20 years ago, I guess now. More than 20 years, because they're over 21. But you don't remember it clearly. And so that's what's happening here. But just keep in mind, there were eyewitnesses to the resurrection, and these Gospels were being written in light of the resurrection. So did they get it all exactly 100% factually correct? No. But they got a glimpse of who Jesus was and is, and what his mission was and is, and what he calls us to do, even today, 2,000 years later. How about stopping there? Does that sound good? Okay. Stop. So we will meet next week, and we will start with Mark. And we will spend 2 weeks on Mark, and if I have any handouts for you all to read, I'll try and get them to you earlier than I did this one. So thank you very much.